I think when we're kids, we don't really realize why our parents are the way they are. And then you start doing some research and you go, oh, okay, now that makes sense.
That was poet Shizue Seigel. I'm Jeff, and this is Storied San Francisco. In this episode, Shizue shares the story of her mom and her grandparents through colorful tales, from Kumamoto province in Japan, through the sugar fields in Hawaii, and finally to farmland near San Luis Obispo. She wraps up this episode with the tale of her paternal grandparents' journey, from Japan to Hawaii, and then to Stockton. Here's Shizue.
So the ancestors that I have researched the most are the ones that I actually knew before they died. Right. So that would be my mother's mother, Umematsu Tsutsumi, and her first husband died before I was born.
Okay.
But they had come, Sakuichi and Umematsu. That
was her first husband.
Umematsu was my grandmother's name. Her maiden name was Umematsu Yokote.
Okay.
And my grandfather's name was Sakuichi Tsutsumi.
Okay.
And they both came from Kyushu, in the Kumamoto province of Kyushu, which was the southern island of Japan.
Okay.
And apparently there were some companies there that helped people immigrate.
Okay.
So my grandmother actually was born in Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
But Hawaii was a territory at that time, so she didn't have citizenship.
Right.
But
was she en route to the U.S.? Do you know, or
no?
sorry,
what
not
happened
her, but it was
that
her mother.
She comes from a really, really tiny village in the hills of Kumamoto.
Okay.
And when I got to visit there, I thought, oh my God, it's almost as if they just kept going further and further into the hills to avoid conflict or conscription or whatever. So they were subsistence farmers. Both Umematsu and Sakuichi, their families lived in neighboring villages. But by the time they were born, the family holdings were basically just big enough to maybe raise enough rice to feed a family of 4 or 5.
Wow, okay.
So there wasn't a lot of future there.
Right.
So my grandmother, her parents had heard in the 1890s, they'd heard that they were hiring people to work in sugarcane plantations in Hawaii.
Okay.
So they signed up, and it was a 2 or 3 year contract, and they would pay your passage, and then you would work on a plantation. And the conditions were pretty brutal on these remote plantations, and so they felt like they weren't making any headway. Because they couldn't save money because, the companies used the company store model where they would charge you so much for provisions that all the money that you made was spent just to live. And so then when she had a child, there was they had to bring the children to work in the fields. And then when they got a little older, they would, put them on the side of the field, and they would be subject to the snakes and other dangers around. So my grandmother, I think, anyway, they came back.
To Japan?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my grandmother sort of grew up knowing that she had been born in this exotic land of red soil and, uh, volcanic cliffs
Mm-hmm.
so I think that she sort of had this dream of maybe something bigger than the life that she had.
Mm.
And we're talking really narrow mountain villages
Mm-hmm.
with just enough arable land along the creeks, and then these forested hills that were so thick with bamboo that you couldn't really use them.
You're right.
And so, anyway, apparently there was a guy in a neighboring village that she met at an Obon festival, a summer dance festival.
Okay.
And he said that she was 12 years old at the time.
Okay.
And he said that he was going to America
Okay.
with some other folks, and some of his cousins. So he's talking about the preparations he was making and, uh, wondering what it was going to be like. She was completely intrigued. And he remembered how interested he was. And so 5 years later, when he and his cousins settled outside of San Luis Obispo,
Oh, wow.
and they had rented some land and started growing produce. And I think that when he probably got to San Luis Obispo, he probably thought he had died and gone to heaven
Right.
because the land was so much more spacious than in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
The nearest sort of wide agricultural valley to where my grandparents came from was this town called Yamaga. But I think all the land had been bought up there a long time before, and there was
Mm-hmm.
no way that somebody like him could possibly aspire to much more than what he had.
In San Luis Obispo, it's almost everywhere you look. It's right. It's fertile, arable land.
Right. And the thing is that the European heritage folks focused on wheat, hay, and cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to raise a cow-calf pair, you need about 100 acres.
Wow.
So for 100 or 200 head herd, that is 100 cow-calf pairs, you need 1,000 acres.
Wow.
So there was all these little bits of land along San Luis Creek that the ranchers didn't think were good for anything. So my grandparents and his cousins leased some land, and they were really good at sort of hydraulic engineering because they had to figure out how to water their fields. So in Japan, they would take the water from their local creek and figure out how to bring it to the rice paddies and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a pretty good idea of how to engineer things out of bamboo.
Oh, wow.
Well, in California, the cheap material was redwood.
Okay.
So I have these photos that they took when they made enough money that they hired somebody to come and take these panoramic photos of their farm. And then they also took studio portraits of themselves in
Awesome.
these suits, with the stick
Yes.
pin and the tie.
Yes.
But the thing is that it was the photos of the farms that were the clincher, because they're anybody could walk into a studio with a rented suit.
Right.
But my grandfather and his cousins, they had these photos taken that just show maybe 50 acres and the hills in the background,
Mm-hmm.
and a stack of hay in the foreground, and wagons and plows with horses, and this aqueduct that was probably about 20 feet high, and then tapered down to bring the water to the fields.
That they made.
Yeah, they
Out
built
of
the whole thing
redwood?
out of redwood.
Wow.
And they tarred the seams with with tar.
Redwood that came from Northern California, probably, right?
Yeah, I don't know how far south
They go.
they go.
But from the north. From the direction north, let's say.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I think that the Sierras, if you go straight east, you will eventually get to the Sierras, and I think sequoias grew
Yes.
pretty far south.
Yes.
So, but in any case, yeah, they had seen the windmills that the cattle ranchers were using to pump water into
The
holding
wells.
tanks, and then they would take that water and run it out to the fields. And it just so happened that around that time, San Luis Obispo was growing because the oil had been discovered in the area.
Right.
So there were more people that were moving there. So there was a need for produce. So he happened to come in at the right time, and then so he sent these photos to my grandmother. She always used to say, "No, I'm not a picture bride. I knew him before."
Right. When she was 12.
So, but it's amazing, that he remembered her,
He
that
kept
she
track
made
of her.
such an impression.
Yeah.
From when she was 12 that he proposed when she was 17.
And she was still there. He knew where to find her. All that.
Yeah, because the villages are pretty small, and marriages were arranged by what's called a baishakunin, or go-between.
Okay.
So he apparently wrote to a local baishakunin and said, there was this girl, blah, blah, blah. And then it turned out, and I did not know this until I went back in 2002. I went to Japan, and I went to Kumamoto for the first time. And my mother didn't know where the farm was. All she knew was the name of this town, Yamaga. And then she knew the name of the village. But when we got to Kumamoto, the train station, we went to the tourist office and they said, "Oh, they changed the names of all the villages."
Ooh.
Yeah, we can't tell you where that is anymore.
Oh.
So
names for nothing. Jeez.
So I was so disappointed, that we went into Kumamoto City, and I don't drink usually, but we went to this bar, and I said, "Yeah, let's just get a drink. I'm just so discouraged." Blah blah blah.
Traveling halfway around the world and then finding out that your ancestral village name had changed.
It had disappeared.
I think that you deserve a drink for that one.
So anyway, the bar was not really open. They said, "Oh, well, we're not open yet. We're having band rehearsal."
Okay.
And it turned out that the bar was owned by a gaijin. I think he was Australian.
Okay.
And so he and two of his Western buddies were practicing, and then the bass player came a little bit later. He was a Japanese lawyer.
Okay.
He was a real estate lawyer.
Okay. Ooh,
and anyway, so they let us in, and they served us a drink because they heard my sob story and they felt sorry for me. So we traded stories about how they had come there to study sword fighting, kendo, because
the Australians did.
Yes.
Okay.
Because Miyamoto Musashi, who is the great swordsman of Japan, had actually lived in Kumamoto area a long time ago. I mean, centuries ago.
Sure.
So anyway, it turned out that this lawyer, right, the bass player,
the real estate lawyer,
right, he says, "Oh, I know the name. I know that village. Yeah, they changed the name from this to that, and I have some maps in the car."
Oh.
So he went and he found a place where he could get color Xeroxes at 10 o'clock at night.
Okay.
And then he marked out the route and he told us the bus numbers.
Wow.
And told us where to catch the bus to Yamaga and where to transfer and go to this town in the middle of nowhere.
It's like a treasure map, almost.
Yeah. And I mean, and he says, and when you get there, the bus stop is right across from the sort of the town hall.
Okay.
And you can actually go there and you can get your father's
records and
I'm blanking on the name.
birth certificate.
It's not. It's the family registry.
Got it.
So it actually shows your ancestry going back.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, 1,500 yen. I got my grandfather's and my grandmother's, and they said, "Okay, come back in 20 minutes. We can look it up and crank out a copy for you."
You found the treasure.
Right.
Amazing.
And so we said, "Okay, let's walk around." And but we had no idea where my grandfather's house had been.
Okay.
Right. So we're walking along the creek, and we see this old guy, and we say, "Yeah, come on, my grandfather, used to live around here, and his mother's name was Mika, and she lived." For quite a long time. He says, "Oh, yes, I know where their house is." He says, "Wait right here." He disappears. He comes back on a little putt-putt motorcycle. He leads us to this place. Now, actually, he says, go back in that direction. I'm going to go ahead and warn them that you're coming.
Okay.
So he gets on his little scooter.
Like no strangers had visited in 300 years.
So we get to the house, and this guy says, "Oh yeah, I took care of your great grandmother."
Wow.
And your
Would that
grandfather.
be your grandmother's mother?
It was my grandfather's.
Your grandfather's mother. Okay, got it.
And apparently, they were really grateful to my grandfather because my grandfather gave his little tiny holding, his land holding, to this family in exchange for looking out for them, for his mother. Mm-hmm. And then we went inside, and there is her portrait hanging up in the sitting room.
Wow.
So, I mean, it was just so...
Yeah.
uncanny.
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of times where I felt like, my life is pretty unorthodox, and there's a lot of times where I don't have a clue what I'm doing, but things like this happen.
And it clicks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
your grandmother came over from Japan to the San Luis area, right in there where your grandfather had the land. And
right,
farm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay. And that's all on your mom's side, correct?
Right. That's
okay.
on my mother's side. Her name was Irene Yoshiko Tsutsumi. And the other thing that happened with my grandfather, right, was that in 1910, apparently there was some sort of really big storm along that coast there, and it washed out, it destroyed half of a pier that was being built to ship oil. There was oil being drilled in that area, and they built this pier to ship the oil to refineries, probably in Southern California. So there was this big storm and wiped out half the pier.
Okay.
And they'd already built all these holding tanks for the oil, and there was sort of a little company town there and everything. But after sitting on it for a couple of years, they decided to just give up on it and build another pier further north along the coast. So this land 140 acres of land was all of a sudden sort of released.
Freed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my grandfather got to lease that land.
And was it contiguous with all the other land that he had?
No.
It was separate.
Right. The other land was closer to San Luis, and it was along San Luis Creek, and whereas this was right on the coast. And I think that there were 2 parcels there, and he started out with the uphill one, and then he added the second one later, because there were 2 landowners involved. But my mother was named after Irene Carpenter, who was the wife of the owner of the first parcel.
Oh, okay.
So, so he managed to luck out on this big holding at a time when there were still Japanese immigrants coming. So he built this sort of bunkhouse where people could stay. And it was for, a lot of people working at a farm like this was their first foothold. And then they would be able to save some money and buy their own or rent their own land or start their own business or whatever.
Right.
So,
and what year was your mother born?
My mother was born in 1920.
20, okay.
And, yeah, she has an interesting story too, but I'm actually writing a memoir or a family, sort of a hybrid personal memoir and a family saga.
Okay.
So the first part of it is going to go into detail about my grandparents and my mother, and I'm really fascinated by how circumstance and environment shapes people. I think when we're kids, we don't really realize why our parents are the way they are. And then you start doing some research and you go, oh, okay, now that makes sense.
And you get older yourself. That helps too.
Right.
You discover what decisions are.
Right.
Based on things like environment and circumstance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like for my mother, one of the things, she was very, very stubborn on a certain level. And I think it's because she was born as the 3rd sibling. And by the time she was 2, she was the eldest because the 2 older ones died of scarlet fever.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it completely transformed her life.
Yeah, that'll do it.
From being the pet, the baby, to being the eldest daughter, who is like a glorified servant.
Right.
So yeah, there's just a lot of psychology, and I think that it's really interesting to realize how much of that stuff shapes you. You know, the attitudes that you grew up with, the values that you learn from your parents and your grandparents. Mm-hmm. You know, as a kid, you think, oh, that's how life is. That's how people are. This is normal.
Know, too.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the older you get, the more you realize different people have different values, different circumstances. Some people are very dog eat dog, and some people are very kind and compassionate. Mm-hmm. And that part of it doesn't have to do... I mean, some of it is related to culture, I think, you know. Like I think that I can generalize that a lot of Japanese folks, both Japanese Americans and Japanese in Japan, there's a tendency to internalize and you know, blame ourselves or take on too much responsibility, you know, whereas there are some cultures where no, I deserve everything, and if I don't get my way, it's your fault.
Other opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real conflict with some of the dominant cultures in American history. And families like, you know, my family. Mm-hmm. You know, they were very much community oriented. They were hardworking. They would do things like there was a family that had originally worked on my grandparents' farm, and then they went off on this couple went off on their own. They had a couple of children. The wife died. The husband goes, "How am I going to work if I've got two kids?" So my grandmother took in the two kids for a year.
Wow. Okay.
So that he could go out and work, and then he found somebody else to marry, and then he came and took the kids
Wow.
back. So that kind of thing was really common.
I was going to say also, like you said, with your grandfather, immigrants helping other immigrants
Right.
arrive and get a foothold.
Right.
A lot of that, yeah.
Right. And it's common in many cultures. It's like the Bank of America, for instance, was started by A.P. Giannini, and the Italian immigrants couldn't get loans from American banks, so they sort of pooled their money and among themselves, and took turns borrowing it or doing whatever. And the Japanese had the same kind of system. There were with the Japanese immigrants, a lot of times it was organized by what prefecture or province you came from.
Right.
And then people would put in money every month, and then people would ask, to borrow. I need to buy a tractor. Can I borrow the money? And blah blah blah. So there would be a joint decision made somehow as to who would be able to use the money at a specific time. Mm-hmm. And the value systems were such that, I think in Japan, if you did not do the right thing, you were ostracized. Mm-hmm. Basically, nobody in the village would talk to you. Right. So it was a self-reinforcing thing. Right. Although I've heard stories about people that didn't fit that, but I know that for me, on both sides of my family, my mother's and my father's, they had really strong value systems that had to do with hard work and honesty, compassion. They were really involved in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty modest about what they did. Mm-hmm. It was sort of like, why do you need to brag? Why do you need to show off? Right. You don't need to brag, because doing the right thing is just what you do. Yeah.
Can we talk about your dad's side?
Yeah. My father's side. Oh, I have to tell you one other thing about my mother's father. Please. And I did not know this until I went to Japan in 2003. That I got his family tree, and where his father's name should have been, it was blank. So I asked one of my aunts who had come from Japan, and
it's not immaculate conception.
She said, "Oh, that means he was illegitimate."
Oh.
And she says, "I know this because when Uncle Frank proposed to me in 1948, I took the train all the way down there, and I got this paperwork, and I looked at that, and I didn't tell anybody. And don't you tell anybody. Don't tell my daughters. Don't tell anybody that your grandfather was illegitimate." Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Anyway.
So his mom was probably ostracized.
Yes.
For that, yeah.
Yeah, and he didn't have a future. Right. Not only did he have a very small holding, but because he was illegitimate, he really didn't have a future there. Right. Because I always wondered, I knew so many families that they made a lot of money, or a decent amount of money, and then they went back to Japan. So why didn't he do that? Right. Yeah. So my father's side, they came from Hiroshima area, and which is a lot more sort of urbanized. And my father's parents ran a single-room occupancy hotel in Stockton, inner city Stockton.
So they moved from Hiroshima
Yeah, they came
to
from
California.
Hiroshima. They went to Hawaii first.
Oh.
They didn't do well in Hawaii. The father said they stayed in Hawaii long enough to have 2 sons.
Okay.
Then the father says, we're not getting anywhere here. So you take the boys back to Japan, and I'll go ahead to California. And when I get settled, I'll call for you. So she takes the 2 boys back to Hiroshima. And
who had the harder job there? Right? I think your grandmother did.
Oh, my grandmother was amazing. Her story, she was like a saint in the family, and she sort of is the inspiration for that painting I did Imperatrix Mundi, where the Japanese grandmother is like the real ruler of the world.
Forget
it's
Napoleon.
like, forget Napoleon.
Yeah. So that's inspired by your grandmother?
Yeah.
Or that face, okay.
Yeah, she doesn't look anything like that. She was very skinny.
Okay.
But she had this spiritual force that for decades after she died in the mid-50s, and she raised she had 10 kids, right? And then they had kids, and I remember counting the relatives. I don't know, before all the grandkids,
your generation.
My generation. At one time, I counted them, and there were 65 relatives at that time.
Goodness.
Just
just from
aunts
the 2
and
of
uncles
your
and
grandparents.
cousins.
Oh my goodness.
And we were so close knit in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and they were very sort of humble in a lot of ways, and they had a great sense of humor. Most of them, and most of them had kind of working class jobs. Most of them didn't go to college. They weren't really into book learning that much. Even the ones that did go to college, they sort of did practical kinds of work, except for my father. My father was the intellectual of the family.
Was he the oldest or the second born?
No, he was the oldest of the middle set.
Oh, okay.
So there was some older siblings, and then there was a middle set.
Okay.
And then there was a couple of younger ones.
Okay.
So my father was the oldest of that set in the middle.
And some of his siblings were born in the U.S. or some of the younger ones?
They were all born in the U.S. except for the 2 oldest ones had been born in Hawaii.
Okay.
But those 2 oldest ones, when my grandmother, she went back to Japan, she waited for 2 years for my grandfather to send for her.
Okay.
Never heard from him. So
I had a sneaking suspicion that was going to be part of the story.
So
men are just the worst. Sorry.
Oh, and he was a spoiled oldest son.
Oh, goodness.
And his parents didn't want him to go in the first place because they wanted to rely on him in their old age. But he wanted to go to America, blah, blah, blah.
Did anyone ever track him down?
So what happened was she left the 2 boys with her in-laws. And she borrowed enough money to go to the U.S. And she had some lucky breaks along the way too, because she had no idea where he would be. Mm-hmm. But things happened, like on the ship from Hiroshima to Yokohama. She befriends, because she's a very warm person, she befriends a Chinese woman who is a nursemaid for the British Council's family. And the woman is like crying every day because she didn't want to leave Shanghai. But she's got this job to take care of this infant, not only across the Pacific, but across the U.S. to London.
And then the Atlantic, yeah.
So, she says, I don't know what to do. I love my fiance so much, but he said this would be a good opportunity, blah, blah, blah. So my grandmother says, follow your heart. So when they get to Yokohama, she quits the job And she recommends my grandmother for the job. So my grandmother gets free passage.
Oh, wow.
Taking care of this infant, on the trip from Yokohama to San Francisco.
Okay.
And it helped her also get through customs and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, you're doing such a great job. You're so great with the baby. Why don't you come with us to New York? And my grandmother said, no, I have to find my husband. Okay. So, but she goes to the prefectural association, right? And by the way,
here in San Francisco?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At that time, it was before Angel Island. Angel Island hadn't been built yet. So the ships would come into the Oriental Mail pier, which was like around Brannan and the Embarcadero.
Okay.
But the little Japantown at that time was on Stevenson Alley, around 5th
South of
and
Market.
6th streets.
Okay.
So there were Japanese hotels, there were manju shops, sweet shops, bathhouses, employment places.
Not far from what is now what's left of Manila Town. Down there.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that area was pretty badly damaged by the earthquake.
Yeah.
And then it moved over to South Park, the Japantown.
Oh.
After the quake. But anyway, so she went to the prefectural association and said, I'm the Hiroshima Kenjinkai, and she says, I'm looking for my husband, blah blah blah. And somebody said, oh, I think he's working on an onion farm in the Delta.
Okay.
So she goes, and in those days you could take a ferry all the way up the Delta.
Wow. Okay.
So she took the ferry to Stockton, and then somehow she got to, this place where he was. And she talked herself into a job as the cook and the washerwoman.
That was Shizue Seigel. On the next episode of Storied San Francisco, Shizue concludes the story of her ancestors and her own life. Part 2 drops tomorrow, not Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Music for the podcast was produced, performed, and curated by Otis McDonald. Original photography is by Michelle Kilfeather. Aaron Lim of Bitch Talk Podcast is our contributing producer. And the show is produced and hosted by me, Jeff Hunt. Now in our 4th season, we have more than 160 episodes available on our website, storiedsf.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you can, please rate and review our show so we can reach even more folks. We love email. Drop us a line at storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay healthy, keep dreaming, and we'll see you next time on Storied San Francisco.
This podcast is a proud member of the BFF.FM podcast network. Learn more at podcasts.bff.fm.
BFF.FM, best frequencies forever.